The night before my brother's wedding, my mother sent a text colder than Boston glass in mid-January. Do not come. The Whitmores refuse to have the person who bankrolled half this family in their photos. 6 months ago, I bought my sister a Charles River penthouse. Tonight, I discovered they promised it to the newlyweds. Banning me was supposed to protect their lie. But their biggest mistake is letting me walk away with the title deeds. My name is Avery Ford. I am 34 years old. I am the Director of Crisis Strategy for Halcyon Grid Advisory, a firm based in the heart of Boston. My daily existence revolves around managing the unmanageable. When a tech chief executive gets caught in a federal scandal, I am the one who builds the firewall. When a legacy corporation faces a catastrophic supply chain failure, I am the one who drafts the narrative that saves the stock price. I deal in hard facts, cold leverage, and absolute control. Tonight, the crisis was not a client. The crisis was my own blood. It was 11:45 at night. I was alone on the 40th floor, the city lights reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling glass of my corner office. I was finalizing a severe risk assessment for a pharmaceutical merger. The silence was absolute. Then, my phone vibrated against the mahogany desk. A single, abrasive buzz. I reached for it, expecting a panicked executive. Instead, the screen displayed a name I rarely saw outside of bank transfer requests. Elaine Ford, my mother. I opened the message. There was no greeting. There was no preamble. The text was colder than the Boston glass against my forehead in mid-January. It was an eviction notice from my own family. The family had convened, she wrote, and they had reached a unanimous decision. I was instructed not to attend my younger brother Nolan's wedding the following day. My presence, Elaine explained, would make the family story incredibly difficult to justify to the wealthy in-laws. Nolan was marrying Celeste Whitmore. The Whitmores were the epitome of Beacon Hill royalty. They owned yachts they never sailed and summer homes they never visited. They demanded pedigree. Elaine spelled it out with breathtaking cruelty. The Whitmores believed the Fords were a lineage of old New England money. They believed we were steeped in generational wealth and quiet aristocratic grace. And me. I ruined the aesthetic. I was a self-made woman who clawed her way to the top of corporate crisis management. I dealt with the dirty, aggressive realities of modern business. I did not fit the image. I was a glaring reminder of effort and labor. I was not invited because my success proved their wealth was a fabrication. I sat perfectly still. I did not shed a tear. I did not feel the sudden rush of heat that precedes a screaming phone call. Tears are a biological response to unexpected pain. Anger is the refuge of those who still expect fairness. I expected nothing from them. The rejection triggered a different mechanism entirely. The strategist took over. When a hostile entity attempts to remove you from the board, they are rarely acting out of pure spite. They are moving you because you are standing on something they need to steal. My hands moved across the keyboard. I ignored the wedding drama entirely. I bypassed the emotional damage. My mind locked onto the largest financial vulnerability in my portfolio linked to the Ford name. 6 months ago, I purchased a luxury penthouse overlooking the Charles River, a multi-million-dollar property bought for one reason: to house my older sister, Marissa. She had just emerged from a highly publicized, brutal divorce from a real estate developer. She had lost her home and her social standing. I had bought that penthouse to give her a secure fortress to rebuild her life. I opened my encrypted personal server. I pulled up the legal directory for the Back Bay property. I started cross-referencing the trust documents, the escrow releases, the title transfers. I read through the dense legal language, searching for the anomaly. I am paid to spot the single loose thread that unravels a corporate empire. It took me 17 minutes to find it in my own life. It was a tiny, seemingly insignificant administrative oversight, but it was fatal. The final transfer deed, the specific piece of paper that formally granted Marissa conditional residency rights under my trust structure, it had been signed, it had been notarized, but it had not been officially recorded at the State Registry of Real Estate Records. In the eyes of the digital system, the final lock had not engaged. The property was in a state of legal twilight. My pulse remained steady, but my mind accelerated. I needed secondary confirmation. A crisis manager never acts on a single point of failure. I opened a sterile browser. I logged into a ghost account I used to monitor social media footprints of volatile clients. I navigated to Nolan's profile. Nolan is driven by vanity. Vanity always creates a trail of evidence. I dug into his recent activity, scanning tagged photos and deleted archives. I found it in a leaked draft folder from his public relations coordinator. A photograph meant for a curated bridal magazine feature, accidentally exposed for a few hours before being restricted. I stared at the image. Nolan and Celeste, dressed in immaculate designer clothing, standing in the private foyer of the Back Bay penthouse, the property I purchased with my own capital. Below the image was a drafted caption. It spoke of new beginnings and generational blessings. It referred to the penthouse as the ultimate family gift for the newlyweds. The reality of the situation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The text from my mother was not merely an insult to keep an embarrassing relative away from high society. It was a calculated, preemptive strike. It was the surgical removal of a key witness. They needed me away from the ceremony because they were about to formalize a massive, multi-million-dollar fraud. They were taking the sanctuary I provided for my sister and repackaging it as a dowry for my brother. They believed that if I was kept in the dark for 48 hours, the paperwork would be signed, the marriage would be sealed, and I would be forced to accept the theft to avoid a public scandal. I picked up my phone. The clock read 12:20 in the morning. I dialed the direct cell number of my private attorney, Rowan Bell. Rowan is a man who measures his life in billable increments and legal victories. He answered on the third ring. His voice was sharp, cutting through the static. I bypassed the standard pleasantries. I gave him a rapid, precise set of instructions. I told him to initiate a total lockdown on the Back Bay property. I demanded an immediate, exhaustive review of all ownership files, all residency agreements, all mortgage databases, and every single guarantee attached to that address. I instructed him to look for shadow loans, unauthorized liens, or any third-party claims. Rowan paused for a fraction of a second. He asked if there was a problem with the wedding schedule. I told him there was no wedding schedule to concern us. I told him we were dealing with an active financial crime. I ended the call. I set the phone down on the smooth glass surface of my desk. I turned my chair to face the window. The city of Boston sprawled out below me, a grid of lights and shadows. I did not think about the floral arrangements. I did not think about Celeste walking down the aisle. I did not think about my mother smiling for the cameras. The familial connection was severed. The emotional debt was canceled. I was no longer a daughter or a sister seeking validation. I was a principal investor who had just discovered embezzlement within the ranks. I watched the headlights of a solitary car cross the bridge over the dark water. Only one thought echoed in the quiet space of my office. A single dangerous question that would dictate my every action moving forward. How much more have they taken from me that I do not even know about, yet I grew up in the quiet, relentlessly average suburbs of Worcester. We were not poor. We never experienced the kind of desperate, crushing poverty that forces a family to skip meals or sleep in cars. We had a 2-story colonial house with a paved driveway and a lawn that my mother insisted on keeping perfectly manicured. But within those walls, resources were allocated with the ruthless precision of a corporate bankruptcy. Affection, attention, and financial support were not distributed equally. They were treated as high-yield investments, funneled exclusively toward the children who possessed what my parents considered social value. I was not one of them. Marissa was the family's public offering. She was the face we presented to the neighborhood and the church. She had soft, agreeable features, an effortless charm, and a natural ability to navigate social hierarchies without ever appearing to try. My mother, Elaine, groomed her like a racehorse. There were voice lessons, private gymnastics coaches, and imported silk dresses for holiday parties. When Marissa turned 16, Elaine spent $1,200 on a custom pageant gown, draining the emergency savings account without a second thought. Marissa was considered an asset that needed to be polished. Her sole purpose was to maintain our image and, eventually, marry into a tax bracket that would elevate us all. Nolan, on the other hand, was the great male hope. My father, Victor Ford, was a middle management logistics supervisor who spent his entire life convinced he was a misunderstood business tycoon. He projected every ounce of his unfulfilled ambition onto his only son. Nolan was given a blank check for his potential. Over the years, Victor poured tens of thousands of dollars into Nolan's half-baked entrepreneurial fantasies. There was a luxury sneaker resale business that collapsed in 6 months. There was a boutique digital marketing agency that never acquired a single client. Victor took out a second mortgage to fund a craft brewery app for Nolan, waving away the risk by claiming that real wealth requires aggressive seed funding. Nolan's catastrophic financial failures were never called failures. They were delicately referred to as temporary phases or stepping stones. And then there was me. I was the pragmatic department. I was the child assigned the role of being sensible. Sensible is the word parents use for a child they do not want to spend any money on. When I was 17 years old and looking at university brochures, there was no discussion of campus tours or tuition assistance. My father gave me a sympathetic pat on the shoulder and delivered a stern lecture about the realities of household debt. I was expected to understand. I did not argue. I secured my own path. I worked a graveyard shift at a 24-hour diner on Route 9, serving lukewarm coffee to truck drivers for $7.15 an hour. I spent my break studying advanced calculus and writing application essays in the glow of the kitchen fryers. I earned a full-ride academic scholarship to a prestigious university in the city. When I brought the acceptance letter home, the reaction was a masterclass in emotional suppression. Elaine told me to keep my voice down and not to brag about it at Sunday dinner. Nolan had just failed his macroeconomics midterm, and my mother insisted that my success would make him feel awkward. There was never any physical abuse in the Ford household. There were no dramatic, screaming matches or shattered plates for me to discuss with a therapist later in life. There was only a quiet, glacial freeze. It was a prolonged, invisible neglect that spanned 2 decades. My achievements were treated as administrative footnotes. My basic needs were considered a nuisance. I learned very early that my existence was tolerated, but my value was strictly utilitarian. I left Worcester the week I turned 18. I packed 2 suitcases, boarded a commuter bus, and never moved back. I built myself from the ground up, brick by agonizing brick. I navigated corporate ladders in cheap, ill-fitting suits until I could afford tailored wool. I spent my 20s studying crisis management, contract law, and corporate psychology while my peers were out wasting their weekends. By the time I reached my early 30s, I had carved out a formidable reputation in the risk advisory sector. I became the strategist that powerful executives called when they were bleeding millions or facing federal indictments. Inevitably, I also became the person my family called. The dynamic shifted when I turned 30. I was no longer the invisible middle child. I was the fixer. The phone calls from Worcester resumed, but they were never to ask about my health or my career. The phone only rang when there was a fire to put out. It was Victor, needing $8,000 to cover an unexpected tax penalty. It was Elaine, demanding I review a complex leasing contract for Marissa because the legal jargon was giving her a migraine. I paid for defense attorneys when Nolan got into an altercation that threatened his insurance rates. I quietly settled 5-figure credit card debts when Marissa bought into a luxury lifestyle she could not sustain. I became a walking, breathing, automated teller machine. They dressed their financial demands in the warm, manipulative language of familial duty. They always promised it was just a temporary bridge loan. They always swore they just needed my help one last time. Every single time was the last time. I am a crisis strategist. I dissect exploitation for a living. I can spot a parasitic business relationship from a mile away. I knew exactly what my family was doing. I saw the manipulation as clearly as a red line on a balance sheet. Yet, I signed the checks. I reviewed the documents. I wired the funds. I did it because beneath the cold exterior and the corporate armor, there was still a pathetic, lingering fraction of my childhood self that believed in the transaction. I operated under the delusion that if I solved enough of their problems, if I provided enough undeniable value, the ledger would eventually balance. I thought I could buy my way into their affection. I desperately hoped that one day they would look at me and see a daughter, a sister, an equal. I wanted to be invited to the family table not to clear the dishes or pay the restaurant bill, but simply because they wanted my company. It was a foolish, expensive hope. I knew I was being used, but I willingly blinded myself to the extent of their greed. That deeply rooted, pathetic desire to be recognized as a true member of the Ford family is the only reason I ever considered opening my wallet to secure a high-end property for Marissa. I thought I was buying her a safe harbor after her divorce. I had no idea I was purchasing the very weapon they intended to use to erase me. 6 months before the wedding invitations were printed, my sister's life spectacularly imploded. Her marriage to a prominent real estate investor collapsed under the weight of his hidden debts and federal indictments. The fallout was swift and brutal. The bank seized their primary residence, a sprawling estate in the suburbs. The luxury vehicles were repossessed. Marissa, who had spent the last decade curating a flawless image of generational wealth, suddenly found herself facing civil litigation for joint liabilities she barely understood. Her carefully constructed social circle evaporated overnight. In the world of high society, financial ruin is highly contagious, and no one wanted to catch the disease. My parents did not ask me for help directly. Direct requests can be denied. Instead, they orchestrated a masterpiece of subtle, suffocating pressure. My mother called me on a Sunday afternoon, her voice trembling with manufactured despair. She described Marissa crying on a cheap mattress in a short-term rental, stripped of her dignity. My father took the phone, his tone heavy with paternal disappointment. He casually mentioned that if someone in the family had the means to prevent this tragedy, it was their moral obligation to step in. The message was perfectly clear. I had the capital. If I possessed an ounce of love for my sister, I would provide a landing pad soft enough to preserve her delicate ego. They did not want a lifeline. They wanted a luxury upgrade disguised as salvation. I yielded. I purchased a sprawling penthouse on the 32nd floor of a premier residential tower in Back Bay. The price tag was roughly $4,800,000. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an uninterrupted view of the Charles River, custom Italian cabinetry, and a private, secure elevator bank. It was opulent, quiet, and impenetrable, but I did not survive in my industry by writing blank checks based on emotion. I built a fortress of legal protection around the asset. I placed the property inside a bespoke, irrevocable trust structure. This was a necessary maneuver to shield the multi-million-dollar asset from the aggressive collection agencies still hunting her ex-husband. The terms of our agreement were explicit and legally binding. Marissa was granted immediate, exclusive residency rights. She could live there, decorate it, and find her peace. However, the absolute transfer of ownership would only execute after a probationary period of 24 months. The stipulations were non-negotiable. The transfer was entirely contingent upon her maintaining a clean record. There could be no fraudulent financial claims, no unauthorized secondary mortgages, and absolutely no transferring the use of the property to any third party. It was a generous gift, but it was locked inside a vault of my own design. The day I handed her the master keycard, the emotional performance was staggering. Marissa collapsed into my arms in the marble foyer. She wept openly, her tears staining the lapel of my jacket. She held my hands, looked directly into my eyes, and swore she would never forget the magnitude of my generosity. She called me her savior. Standing in that sunlit room, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and expensive hardwood, I felt a foreign sensation bloom in my chest. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had genuinely done the right thing for my family. I felt a profound, albeit brief, sense of belonging. The illusion lasted exactly 3 weeks. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted. Marissa began treating the property not as a sheltered refuge, but as a conquered territory. I noticed the first signs on her social media feeds. She had hired a team of professional architectural photographers to document the sweeping vistas and the bespoke interior design. Shortly after, the evening gatherings commenced. She started hosting exclusive cocktail hours, inviting the exact same affluent friends who had abandoned her during her divorce. I overheard her at a charity luncheon, holding a crystal flute of champagne, confidently explaining to a group of socialites that she had successfully leveraged her personal investments to maintain her standard of living. My name never crossed her lips. I was entirely redacted from the story of her survival. Then, Nolan recognized the value of the stage. As his own high-stakes wedding to Celeste Whitmore drew closer, the penthouse became his preferred operational base. He began hosting extravagant pre-wedding celebrations in the formal dining room. He organized late-night cigar and whiskey tastings on the private terrace overlooking the city lights. He paraded Celeste's wealthy relatives through the massive living space, gesturing vaguely at the skyline, allowing them to assume the property was a testament to his own entrepreneurial brilliance. He used my asset as a glittering backdrop to validate his fabricated success. Sitting in my office across the city, I observed the encroachment with a growing sense of unease. My professional instincts, the very skills that made me a top-tier crisis manager, screamed at me to intervene. I saw the boundaries being eroded. I saw the entitlement mutating into ownership, but I silenced the alarms. I rationalized the behavior. I told myself that Marissa was merely overcompensating, trying to heal her shattered confidence after a humiliating public defeat. I convinced myself that Nolan was just being a typical, arrogant groom wanting to impress his new family. I chose the path of least resistance. I chose to ignore the quiet alarms ringing in my head. That was my critical failure. I looked at the penthouse and saw a safe harbor for a wounded sister. I did not realize that Marissa never viewed those walls as a home. To her, the imported marble and the panoramic skyline were nothing more than premium currency. She viewed the apartment as a high-value casino chip, a tangible asset she fully intended to slide across the table to purchase status, leverage, and a permanent seat among the elite for the entire Ford family. Nolan's fiancée, Celeste Whitmore, was the youngest daughter of a bloodline so entrenched in Boston's elite that their ancestors probably charged the early colonists rent. The Whitmores resided in a historical fortress on Beacon Hill, a neighborhood where the cobblestones seemed to reject anyone with a net worth under 8 figures. Dining with the Whitmore family was not a culinary experience. It was a rigorous, exhausting audit of your social class. I had only met them once, during a brief, icy cocktail hour where Celeste's mother inspected my posture, my vocabulary, and my shoes, before silently deciding I was practically invisible. To secure a permanent invitation into that suffocating, velvet-lined world, my family had to undergo a complete and total rebranding. To the Whitmores, the Fords were a tapestry of old, quiet New England wealth. My parents had spun a magnificent, deeply fraudulent fairy tale. In this new, heavily curated reality, Victor was no longer a retired logistics manager living on a fixed pension and the periodic wire transfers I sent to keep his electricity running. He was presented as a reclusive private equity investor who simply preferred the quiet life in the suburbs. Marissa was not a destitute divorcee hiding from her ex-husband's furious creditors. She was suddenly introduced as a savvy, independent real estate developer with a diverse portfolio, which, conveniently, only seemed to include the Back Bay property I had purchased with my own capital, and Nolan. Nolan was the absolute crown jewel of this elaborate fiction. He was marketed to the Whitmore patriarch as the brilliant, self-made founder of Briar Hall Collective, a boutique luxury event curation firm that supposedly catered to the ultra-rich. The reality was a financial horror story. Briar Hall Collective was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. It was a glorified party planning service drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of vendor debt. Nolan was barely keeping the lights on, leveraging high-interest business credit cards just to pay for the glossy, embossed brochures he handed out at charity galas. Victor's supposed investments were nothing more than the desperate, four-figure emergency loans I sent him on the first of every month to cover the mortgage on the Worcester house. In this grand theatrical production, there was no role for a 34-year-old crisis management consultant who actually worked for a living. I was the jarring, discordant note in their symphony of lies. Elaine knew that if I walked into that reception, wearing a tailored suit I bought with my own salary, radiating the kind of exhausted competence that only comes from actual labor, the entire facade would crack. I knew the exact negative balance of Victor's checking account. I knew the routing numbers for Nolan's overdue business loans. I was a walking, breathing liability. My exclusion was not a matter of social awkwardness. It was a strict containment protocol meant to protect the narrative. The sheer scale of their audacity only became clear to me through an act of sheer, blind luck. In the insular, hyper-connected world of Boston's elite legal circles, confidentiality is often secondary to professional assumptions and quiet alliances. A senior partner at a prominent family law firm, a man I had collaborated with on a vicious corporate restructuring case 2 years prior, sent me a secure file transfer. He was representing the Whitmore family in the prenuptial negotiations. He assumed, given my reputation in risk advisory and my last name, that I was acting as the shadow counsel for the Ford family's asset protection strategy. He sent me the final summary of the prenuptial addendum as a professional courtesy, asking for a quick strategic review before the ink dried the next morning. I opened the encrypted document on my secondary monitor. I poured a glass of cold water and began to read through the dense legalese. The standard clauses were all present asset separation, alimony caps, rigid non-disclosure agreements regarding the Whitmore family trusts. But on page 14, under a section titled Schedule C, Jointly Accessible Marital Assets, the world suddenly stopped spinning. There, described in meticulous, undeniable legal detail, was the Back Bay penthouse. It was not listed as Marissa's temporary residence. It was not listed as a property held in a protective trust. It was explicitly categorized as a post-marital guaranteed family asset provided by the groom's family. The document outlined a rigid provision granting Nolan and Celeste unhindered, rent-free use of the property for a minimum of 10 years, effectively positioning it as their primary urban residence, fully subsidized by the imaginary Ford family wealth. My chest tightened, a cold vice gripping my ribs, but my breathing remained perfectly level. They were not just playing pretend. They were using a multi-million-dollar asset that belonged exclusively to me as collateral to buy their way into a high-society marriage. The penthouse was the dowry. It was the shiny, heavily insured object dangled in front of the Whitmores to prove that Nolan brought equal financial value to the union. I scrolled down to the annexes, my eyes scanning the supporting documentation used to verify this outrageous legal claim. My blood turned to absolute ice. Attached to the bottom of the file was a scanned document titled Gift Confirmation and Transfer of Title Intent. I zoomed in on the page. The letter stated, in clear, unequivocal language, that I, Avery Ford, formally renounced all future claims to the Back Bay property, granting full and unrestricted equity to Marissa Ford, with the explicit understanding that it would serve as a joint family asset moving forward. At the absolute bottom of the page was my signature. It was not a clumsy, handwritten forgery traced over a window pane. It was a highly sophisticated digital signature, authenticated by a commercial software platform I used regularly for my own consulting contracts. It included a generated timestamp and a verified system trail. To any outside observer, to the Whitmore lawyers, to the banks, it looked perfectly legitimate. It looked ironclad, but I had never generated that document. I had never authorized that transfer. I had never seen that piece of paper in my entire life. The emotional fog evaporated instantly, the lingering sting of a mother's rejection, the dull, familiar ache of being the unloved, utilitarian daughter. All of it vanished. It was entirely replaced by the sharp, crystalline clarity of a professional operating in her element. This was no longer a tragic story about a family that did not know how to love me properly. This was a premeditated, highly coordinated effort to strip me of my wealth using fraudulent documentation. They had crossed the rigid line from toxic family dynamics into federal wire fraud and grand larceny. They had looked at my success, my money, and my carefully constructed legal structures, and decided they could simply take it to fund their pathetic delusions of grandeur. I closed the encrypted file. The wedding, scheduled to begin in less than 18 hours, was no longer a celebration of love. It was not a social event to be mourned. It had transformed into an active, meticulously planned financial crime scene. And my family had absolutely no idea that the victim they thought they had locked out was already standing inside the perimeter, holding all the matches. By 1 o'clock in the morning, my office had transformed into a digital war room. Rowan Bell did not work alone. He initiated a secure connection with a forensic financial investigator, a specialist who treated bank routing numbers and encrypted metadata the way a homicide detective treats physical evidence. We linked our respective servers across a secure, encrypted network. For the next 3 hours, the only ambient sounds were the rhythmic, rapid tapping of keyboards and the low, steady hum of the building's climate control system. We were hunting a digital ghost, dismantling a crime scene piece by piece. Our primary objective was the forged digital signature on the gift confirmation letter. The electronic signature platform I utilize for my consulting firm is fortified with enterprise-grade security protocols. It does not simply stamp a name onto a portable document format file. It meticulously logs the exact Internet Protocol address, the specific hardware device identifier, and the geographical location of the user at the exact millisecond the execution command is initiated. The forensic expert extracted the hidden metadata attached to the fraudulent document. It took him exactly 42 minutes to crack the origin point. The signature was not the result of a sophisticated external cyber attack. It was an intimate, domestic breach. The Internet Protocol address mapped directly to a residential broadband router in the quiet suburbs of Worcester. The device identifier belonged to an outdated, heavy laptop computer I had abandoned in my childhood bedroom nearly 5 years ago. I pulled up my personal calendar and cross-referenced the timestamp on the forgery with my own corporate travel logs. At the exact moment my supposed signature was authorizing the permanent transfer of a multi-million-dollar real estate asset, I was physically standing in a hotel lobby in Denver, Colorado, over 2,000 miles away, negotiating a severance package for a disgraced executive. They had simply walked into my old room, booted up my obsolete machine, bypassed my legacy password, and executed the document. However, a forged document is entirely useless unless it is deployed into the real world. Rowan began pulling the legal threads to determine exactly where Marissa had planted the fake title intent. She had not simply hidden it in a safety deposit box to feel secure. She had actively weaponized the forgery. She submitted the fraudulent letter directly to the Whitmore family's legal representation to definitively prove the Back Bay property was an unencumbered personal asset, completely free of any trust restrictions or third-party oversight. It was the crucial piece of leverage that allowed Nolan to satisfy the stringent real estate guarantees embedded deep within the final draft of the prenuptial agreement. Then, the forensic audit triggered a massive, subterranean tripwire. Nolan had not stopped at using the fake document to merely impress his future in-laws. He had aggressively monetized it. The financial investigator flagged a massive, irregular credit inquiry attached to the property's shadow title. Nolan had taken the forged gift confirmation, along with Marissa's newly fabricated status as the sole owner, to a boutique, high-risk private lending firm named Stonemere Capital. Traditional banking institutions require months to underwrite a commercial mortgage. Private lenders like Stonemere operate in the gray areas of the financial sector, moving incredibly fast and charging exorbitant interest rates, provided the underlying collateral is absolute. Nolan had applied for a massive commercial bridge loan. He explicitly used the guaranteed post-wedding housing security as his primary collateral. Because the prestigious Whitmore name was tangentially attached via the prenuptial drafts, Stonemere expedited the underwriting process. They approved and disbursed $850,000 directly into a corporate account controlled entirely by Nolan. I directed the investigator to trace the flow of that specific capital. Not a single cent of that $850,000 went toward funding the extravagant wedding. There were no wire transfers for imported floral arrangements, bespoke catering, or the luxury hotel venue. The money was immediately funneled into the gaping black hole of Briar Hall Collective. Nolan used my stolen equity to pacify aggressive event vendors, settle outstanding corporate liens, and plug a catastrophic revenue deficit that would have forced his company into involuntary bankruptcy weeks before he ever reached the altar. He was actively buying his own financial survival using my property as currency. The sheer mechanical complexity of the fraud required coordinated participation. I asked Rowan to dig into the Stonemere Capital loan approval process. The compliance protocols for a loan of that magnitude required a recorded verbal confirmation from the involved parties. The investigator pulled the digital communication log submitted with the final loan dossier. There was a definitive record of a 45-minute video conference. The participants were the senior loan officer, Nolan, and my father, Victor Ford. Victor knew everything. He had sat in front of a web camera and actively participated in the deception. I could vividly map out his internal mental gymnastics. He had likely convinced himself that this was merely a temporary, sophisticated business maneuver to bridge a temporary cash flow gap. He probably justified the felony by telling himself they were just borrowing the equity and would quietly repay the principal once Nolan secured access to the Whitmore family wealth after the honeymoon. Victor had willingly co-signed a major financial crime out of a blind, pathetic devotion to his son's fabricated image. But a glaring question remained. How had they kept me entirely in the dark for so long? A property held within a trust generates administrative residue. There should have been automated legal notices, municipal tax reassessment warnings, or physical certified mail generated by the state registry when the shadow inquiries and title modifications were initiated. The answer lay buried in the administrative fine print of the original trust formation documents. The secondary notification address, an archaic failsafe I had established years ago before moving to my current primary residence, was still listed as the family house in Worcester. Elaine was the operational gatekeeper. My mother had systematically intercepted every single piece of certified mail, every banking notice, and every legal warning addressed to me that arrived at her doorstep over the past several months. Instead of forwarding the critical documents to my apartment or my office, she had deliberately destroyed them. She meticulously eliminated the physical paper trail, so I would not detect the massive security breach until the wedding ceremony was over and the Whitmore family was legally bound to the disastrous mess. Her cruel midnight text message banning me from the ceremony was not an emotional outburst. It was simply the final layer of a calculated quarantine protocol. Yet, the most devastating revelation of the entire night was reserved for the very end of the audit. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the forensic expert managed to execute a deep recovery of a cache of deleted email correspondence pulled from the local server footprint of my old laptop. I opened a specific email thread dated exactly 2 months prior. I fully expected to see Nolan begging his sister for a desperate solution to his crippling debts. Instead, I saw Marissa's email address firmly in the sender line. Marissa was the architect. It was my sister who had originally proposed the entire criminal enterprise. In a coldly calculated, methodical message to Nolan, she outlined the exact strategy. She suggested stripping the trust protections, utilizing the abandoned computer to bypass the digital authentication, and converting the penthouse into a family prestige fund. She offered him the collateral he desperately needed to secure his wealthy bride, and in direct exchange, she secured her own permanent, untouchable status within the newly elevated family hierarchy. She willingly and cheerfully sacrificed my financial security to buy her own way back into the elite social circles that had so recently discarded her. I leaned back in my leather chair. The corner office was freezing, but I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no betrayal. I had spent my entire adult life believing I was navigating a series of frustrating individual dysfunctions. I thought my father was perpetually foolish. My mother was chronically cold. My sister was painfully selfish, and my brother was dangerously arrogant. I had always treated their character flaws as isolated, individual variables. I was completely wrong. I had not been betrayed by a single rogue actor desperate for cash. The irrefutable evidence displayed across my glowing monitors proved beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt that I was the victim of a highly coordinated, familial syndicate. Victor, Elaine, Marissa, and Nolan had all gathered around my assets exactly like a corporate boardroom cartel. They had collectively agreed to forge my identity, leverage my private property, and blindfold me, all so they could cash out my life's work to fund their collective delusions. They had passed my property around and signed away my net worth with the exact same casual, united entitlement they would use to split a dinner bill at a restaurant. They believed they were incredibly clever. They believed they had successfully executed a flawless, hostile corporate takeover of my life. They had simply forgotten exactly what I do for a living. The clock struck 4 in the morning. Most people who discover their family has orchestrated a multi-million-dollar fraud would pick up the telephone. They would scream. They would hurl accusations into the receiver, demanding explanations and apologies. I did not touch my phone. Engaging in a hysterical shouting match with Victor or Elaine would only alert them to the breach. It would give them time to scramble, to formulate a defense, or to further obscure the financial trail. I am a crisis strategist. My entire career is built on a single, fundamental principle. Whoever controls the flow of information and the timing of the reveal controls the outcome of the war. I chose to counterattack using the exact methodology that made me formidable in the boardroom. My first maneuver was to execute the kill switch buried deep within the original trust architecture. The residency agreement I had drafted for my sister was generous, but it was not unconditional. It contained a highly specific revocation clause. This legal trapdoor stipulated that if the resident engaged in fraudulent activity, attempted unauthorized financial leverage, or permitted the property to be utilized by unapproved third parties for commercial or personal gain, the residency rights would immediately terminate. Rowan drafted the execution orders. With a few digital strokes, the conditional transfer was completely voided. The Back Bay penthouse instantly reverted to my absolute unencumbered ownership. Legal ownership, however, means nothing if the physical perimeter is not secured. At 5:15 in the morning, I placed a direct call to the director of security at the residential tower. I bypassed the standard concierge desk and provided my master identification credentials. My instructions were precise and uncompromising. First, I ordered a complete purge of the guest access list. Every single temporary digital keycard Marissa had issued to her socialite friends and Nolan's wedding vendors was immediately invalidated. Second, I had the engineering department remotely reset the biometric scanners and access codes for the private elevator that serviced the 32nd floor. Finally, I addressed a petty but necessary detail. I instructed the building manager to place a physical heavy-duty security seal on the custom climate-controlled wine cellar. I knew Nolan had stockpiled thousands of dollars of vintage champagne in that room, fully intending to use my property to host a lavish, private after-party for his new, wealthy in-laws. That door was now locked tight. With the physical asset secured, I directed my attention to the financial hemorrhage. Rowan formulated an emergency cease and desist notice. He dispatched the document via priority courier and secured digital transmission to the chief compliance officer at Stonemere Capital. The document did not mince words. It formally notified the private lending firm that the collateral securing their recent loan was currently the subject of an active multi-party fraud investigation. It explicitly stated that the title intent letter was a forgery. The legal implication was clear. If Stonemere disbursed another single dollar to Nolan's corporate accounts, they would be complicit in federal wire fraud. That single piece of paper forced the lender to immediately freeze the final, crucial tranche of funding. Nolan's financial oxygen supply was abruptly severed on the morning of his wedding. I did not want to retain the property. The marble floors and panoramic views were permanently tainted by their greed. I needed an exit strategy that was fast and entirely liquid. I opened my private contact directory and found the direct line for the chief executive officer of a prominent medical technology firm. 3 months ago, she had toured the building and made an incredibly aggressive, unsolicited cash offer for my unit, which I had politely declined. I called her at 6 o'clock in the morning. I informed her that circumstances had changed. If she was still interested, and if she could bypass the standard inspection contingencies and close the transaction within 7 business days, I would execute the sale at a highly favorable discount. She verbally agreed before the call ended. The asset was already being liquidated. To ensure my family had absolutely no room to maneuver or construct a counter-narrative, I required visual, undeniable proof of their scheme. I contracted a boutique legal technology firm that specializes in digital forensics and evidence extraction. With my authorization as the sole property owner, they pulled the high-definition security camera feeds from the lobby, the service elevators, and the private vestibule spanning the last 4 weeks. The compiled footage was a damning silent film. It showed Nolan and Marissa repeatedly escorting professional lighting crews, interior stylists, and wedding photographers into the building. They were meticulously staging the environment, rearranging my furniture to fabricate the illusion of a perfectly curated home for the happy couple. It was a calculated, visual lie captured from multiple angles. By 8 o'clock in the morning, my conference table was covered in pristine, meticulously organized evidence packages. Rowan's paralegals had assembled 4 identical dossiers. The physical binders contained the forensic metadata, proving the signature forgery, the voided trust documents, the communication logs with the predatory lender, and high-resolution still frames printed from the security footage. One dossier was allocated for Celeste. One was designated for her formidable family attorney. One was destined for the legal department at Stonemere Capital. The final binder was prepared for the building's homeowner association board, ensuring Marissa would never be allowed past the front desk again. Rowan asked if I wanted him to dispatch a process server to the cathedral to interrupt the morning ceremony. I declined the suggestion immediately. Crashing a wedding mid-vow is a theatrical, emotional reaction. It allows the perpetrators to play the victim in front of an audience. I had absolutely no intention of stopping them from standing at the altar. I wanted Nolan and Celeste to sign the marriage certificate. I wanted my family to smile for the cameras, to drink the champagne, and to firmly believe they had successfully pulled off the greatest con of their lives. I intended to let them climb to the absolute highest peak of their fabricated triumph. Only then, when they felt entirely untouchable, would I pull the structural foundation right out from under their feet. I stood up and walked toward the window, watching the morning sun break over the Boston skyline. A profound shift had occurred within my mind over the last 8 hours. For over 2 decades, every decision I made regarding my family was filtered through the desperate, lingering hope of a daughter who just wanted to be valued. I was always seeking a seat at a table that was never meant for me. That pathetic, hopeful version of myself was completely dead. I was no longer a discarded sibling begging for inclusion. I was a sophisticated property owner responding to an organized, hostile attack on my assets. I was not going to ask for an apology. I was going to execute a total liquidation. By 10 o'clock on the morning of the ceremony, the atmosphere inside the bridal suite of the luxury hotel was thick with the scent of imported white roses and unspoken relief. I was not there. My mother, Elaine, stood near the velvet drapes, exhaling a long breath she had seemingly held for months. In their minds, they had successfully navigated the final hurdle. They had surgically removed the only liability from their perfect picture. The coast was entirely clear. Marissa glided through the pre-ceremony champagne reception in a custom silk gown that cost more than my entire first year of university tuition. She held court among the early arrivals. She proudly announced to anyone who would listen that her Back Bay penthouse would serve as the venue for an exclusive, intimate welcome dinner for the newlyweds after their 2-week honeymoon in the Mediterranean. Nolan was practically glowing in the center of the room. He stood by the ice sculpture, accepting firm handshakes and admiring nods from the Whitmore patriarchs. He played the role of the self-made titan flawlessly, projecting the image of a man who had single-handedly financed a six-figure wedding and secured a permanent, luxurious future for his bride. But the illusion was already beginning to fracture. Just behind the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom, chaos was taking root. At exactly 11:15 in the morning, the lead audio-visual vendor received an automated alert on his tablet. The final wire transfer, a required payment of $22,000 meant to clear before the ceremony began, had bounced hard. The private bridge loan from Stonemere Capital was officially frozen. The banquet manager, a man accustomed to dealing with high-strung clients, found himself frantically dialing Nolan's cellular phone. Nolan slipped away from a conversation about yacht maintenance to take the call in a dimly lit service hallway, the color completely drained from his face. The vendors were threatening to pack up the lighting rigs and the sound system right then and there. Panic requires immediate capital. Nolan cornered Victor in the men's lounge. There was no time to secure another fraudulent loan or beg a friend for a favor. The crisis was immediate and terminal. Victor, sweating profusely inside his tailored tuxedo, was forced to make a devastating choice to keep the charade alive. He logged into his personal banking application on his phone. With shaking fingers, he initiated an emergency liquidation from his modest retirement account. He transferred $35,000, absorbing massive early withdrawal penalties, just to keep the floral arrangements on the tables and the string quartet playing in the background. It was the absolute last of his legitimate safety net, burned in seconds to protect a lie from collapsing before the vows were even spoken. While the Ford men scrambled in the hallways to plug the financial holes, Celeste was sitting in the makeup chair, sensing the subtle, undeniable vibrations of a collapsing structure. She asked Nolan a simple, practical question regarding the final signature required on the post-wedding housing documents. Nolan immediately broke eye contact, stammering about minor administrative delays and banking holidays. Marissa, hovering entirely too close, immediately jumped in. She answered for him, her voice pitched half an octave too high, assuring Celeste that the lawyers were just being overly thorough. Elaine, usually composed and calculating, was pacing the perimeter of the room, snapping at the catering staff with uncharacteristic tension. The fatal seed of doubt was planted exactly 20 minutes before the procession. A bridesmaid, a woman who moved in the same peripheral corporate circles as some of my former clients, leaned over while adjusting Celeste's veil. She casually mentioned that it was incredibly generous of Avery to provide such a stunning piece of real estate for the family to use. Celeste froze. She asked the bridesmaid to repeat herself. The bridesmaid, realizing she might have crossed an invisible social line, quickly backpedaled. She muttered that she had simply heard a rumor in passing that Avery was the actual buyer of the property, not Marissa. Celeste did not say another word. She sat in complete silence for 5 solid minutes, staring blankly at her own reflection in the vanity mirror, the gears in her mind slowly beginning to turn against the narrative she had been sold. 2 miles away, the heavy wooden doors of the historic cathedral swung open. The organ music swelled, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The congregation stood. I was not in a pew. I was sitting at the polished oak conference table in Rowan Bell's office, drinking black coffee. My laptop screen was divided into 4 active quadrants. I was monitoring the digital pulse of my counteroffensive, watching the dominoes fall in real time. In the top left quadrant, I received the official confirmation email from the Back Bay Building Management. The new security protocols were entirely active. The locks were changed. The temporary access codes were wiped. The property was physically sealed. In the top right, a secure message arrived from the medical technology executive. Her legal team had approved the rapid purchase agreement, and the initial earnest money deposit of $500,000 had already cleared my holding account. In the bottom half of the screen, Rowan forwarded the panicked, aggressive emails bouncing back from Stonemere Capital's legal department, demanding immediate clarification from Nolan regarding the frozen collateral. I watched the digital clock on my monitor tick forward. I knew exactly what was happening at that precise moment. Nolan was standing at the altar. He was holding Celeste's hands, looking her in the eyes, and swearing an oath built entirely on a stolen foundation. I could have sent a text message to the bride. I could have dispatched a courier to the church steps with the forensic files. I could have shattered the wedding before the priest pronounced them husband and wife. But stopping the wedding mid-stride would have given them an excuse. It would have allowed my family to spin the story, to claim I ruined their special day out of petty jealousy and bitterness. It would have made me the villain in their tragedy. I did not want to be the villain. I wanted to be the consequence. I needed them to cross the threshold. I needed Nolan to sign the binding legal register. I needed Marissa to toast to her own fake generosity. I let them walk freely into the trap of their own making, allowing them to fully commit to the illusion. I let them step truly and deeply into their decision. I would let them enjoy the applause and the lavish reception. I would wait until the absolute peak of their arrogance before I opened the final door. I did not need to be physically present in the grand ballroom of the historic hotel overlooking Boston Harbor to know exactly how the evening commenced. The venue was a masterpiece of old-world architecture, deliberately chosen to project a legacy that my family simply did not possess. Every crystal chandelier, every imported silk tablecloth, and every perfectly polished silver fork was strategically placed to tell a compelling story of flawless generational wealth. I tracked the timeline of the reception from my office, watching the social media tags populate in real time. I knew the exact schedule of events, and I knew exactly when the structural integrity of their fantasy would fail. At 8 o'clock, the formal speeches began. Elaine stood before a meticulously curated crowd of 200 affluent guests, holding a flute of vintage champagne. I could easily envision her practiced, aristocratic smile. According to the high-definition videos uploaded by the bridesmaids, my mother delivered an absolute masterclass in fiction. She raised her glass and publicly praised Nolan, calling him a man who had built his own magnificent future with his bare hands. She spoke of his relentless work ethic, his brilliant business acumen, and his unwavering dedication to providing for his new bride. Sitting at the head table, Marissa nodded along in perfect synchronization. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, projecting the image of a devoted older sister who had made quiet, noble sacrifices to elevate her younger brother to this pinnacle of success. It was a beautiful, heartwarming performance designed to cement their new status. It was also the exact moment the rot began to eat completely through the floorboards. Across the crowded ballroom, Celeste felt her cellular phone vibrate incessantly inside her heavily beaded evening clutch. It was an urgent notification from the senior partner at the family law firm representing the vast Whitmore estate. The email contained a single, chilling sentence. It read that they needed to speak immediately regarding the real estate addendum attached to the marital contract. The bride excused herself from the lavish, 5-course dinner service. She navigated through the sea of rustling taffeta and tailored tuxedo jackets, seeking the absolute privacy of the marble-lined powder room. She locked the heavy wooden door behind her, isolating herself from the booming bass of the reception band. Standing beneath the harsh, unforgiving vanity lights, she opened the encrypted file attached to the email. For the first time, Celeste completely bypassed the dense legal jargon and stared directly at the supporting documentation. She magnified the screen, examining the gift confirmation letter bearing my digital signature. She did not know me well, but she possessed the refined, predatory instincts of a woman raised in a world where assets are fiercely guarded and constantly targeted. Something about the document felt deeply unsanitary. It was far too convenient, perfectly timed to satisfy the aggressive prenuptial requirements her father had demanded. The sterile perfection of the electronic signature felt hollow and manufactured. She returned to the reception hall, her stomach twisting into a tight, agonizing knot. The string quartet was playing a lively, upbeat waltz, but the music sounded distorted and menacing to her ears. She approached the open bar near the outdoor terrace, seeking a glass of iced, sparkling water to settle her rapidly fraying nerves. It was there she encountered an elderly cousin from my father's side of the family. He was a bitter, loud man who had spent the last 3 hours aggressively consuming top-shelf scotch on Nolan's rapidly collapsing tab. The old man leaned heavily against the polished mahogany bar, slurring his words as he offered a clumsy, unsolicited toast to the bride. He chuckled, a wet, rough sound that cut through the polite chatter, and leaned in entirely too close to Celeste. He loudly proclaimed that it was a spectacular, wildly expensive party, adding a careless, fatal observation. He stated with absolute drunken certainty that without Avery and her massive checkbook, this family would not even have a wedding to attend. The color completely drained from Celeste's face. The stray, toxic comment from a drunk relative dovetailed perfectly with the strange warning from her attorney and the whispered rumors from her bridesmaid earlier that morning. The pristine, untouchable image of the Ford family was dissolving right in front of her eyes, revealing a hollow, desperate, parasitic core. Simultaneously, at a secluded table near the kitchen doors, the physical traps I had set finally snapped shut. Marissa felt her phone ring. The caller identification displayed the front desk of the Back Bay residential tower. She answered with an annoyed but hushed tone, expecting a trivial question about a late floral delivery for the after-party. Instead, the night manager delivered the script exactly as I had instructed. He informed her in a flat, corporate tone that her access privileges to the 32nd floor had been entirely suspended. He stated that the property was currently under an active, high-level legal review status. He explicitly ordered her not to bring any guests, photographers, or vendors to the premises that night, warning that building security would intercept and detain anyone attempting to bypass the lobby. Marissa dropped her phone onto the linen tablecloth. The color vanished from her cheeks, leaving her pale, wide-eyed, and visibly shaking. The luxurious, multi-million-dollar safety net she had woven out of my money had just evaporated into thin air. She immediately stood up, practically running across the dance floor to the head table. She dug her manicured nails deep into Nolan's shoulder, leaning down to whisper frantically into his ear. She told him that the apartment was locked, the security codes were wiped, and that Avery must have executed a legal maneuver to seize the property back. A rational man, caught in a lie of this staggering magnitude on his wedding night, would have pulled his new wife aside. He would have taken Celeste into a quiet room, confessed the entire miserable truth, and thrown himself upon her mercy. But Nolan was not a rational man. He was a coward who had spent his entire life being shielded from the consequences of his own disastrous actions by his parents and his sisters. Nolan chose the absolute worst possible course of action. He decided to try and contain the explosion. He whispered back to Marissa, formulating a disastrous, panicked plan on the spot. He told her to quietly gather Victor and Elaine. They would slip out through the service elevators, drive across the city to the tower, resolve the lockout issue with the building management through sheer intimidation, and return to the reception before the cake-cutting ceremony. He honestly, pathetically believed he could fix a federal fraud case in under 1 hour. Sitting in the silence of the law office, I watched the digital tracking software on my laptop confirm their sudden, desperate movement. 4 distinct dots, representing the cellular phones of my immediate family, detached from the hotel's location data and began moving rapidly toward the city center. What Nolan completely failed to realize was that he was no longer operating in a blind vacuum. Celeste was watching him intently from across the room. She saw the panicked whisper. She saw the subtle, coordinated, and highly suspicious exit of her new husband and his entire family. She did not scream. She did not cause a scene or demand the music stop. The aristocratic training of the Whitmore family overrode her initial shock, replacing it with a cold, calculating anger. Celeste quietly handed her glass to a passing waiter. She gathered the heavy silk train of her gown and slipped out the front doors of the hotel, completely bypassing the valet stand. She hailed a waiting black town car on the street. She instructed the driver to follow the luxury sedan that had just aggressively pulled out of the underground parking garage. She sat alone in the back seat, staring out at the passing streetlights, the cold dread solidifying into absolute certainty in her chest. She did not alert her parents. She did not call her lawyer back. She simply followed the taillights into the dark night, guided by a profound, chilling intuition that the ceremonial part of her marriage was permanently over, and the brutal era of absolute truth had just begun. The black luxury sedan screeched to an erratic halt outside the polished glass doors of the Back Bay residential tower. I observed their arrival from the recessed alcove of the grand lobby, perfectly concealed by the heavy shadows of a massive architectural pillar. Victor, Elaine, Marissa, and Nolan spilled out of the vehicle like panicked passengers fleeing a rapidly sinking vessel. Their formal, extravagant wedding attire looked entirely absurd within the sterile, ultra-modern environment of the building. Nolan was visibly sweating through the collar of his bespoke tuxedo jacket. Marissa was clutching her heavily beaded evening bag with such ferocity that her knuckles were completely white. They rushed the concierge desk in a chaotic cluster, entirely bypassing the standard polite greetings. Marissa marched straight toward the private, secure elevator bank that serviced the upper levels. She slapped her digital keycard against the biometric scanner panel. A harsh, flat, electronic tone echoed through the cavernous marble space. A solid red light illuminated on the display screen. Access denied. She struck the panel again with the card, and again. Her breathing became shallow and erratic, her chest heaving under the silk of her gown. She spun around toward the night manager at the front desk, her voice escalating into a shrill, commanding demand, demanding to know exactly why the private carriage to her residence was locked down. While Marissa was yelling at the staff, Victor was frantically scanning the perimeter of the grand lobby. He noticed the massive, elaborate floral installations flanking the main entryway. Just a few hours prior, those towering white orchids bore elegant, gold-lettered ribbons prominently displaying congratulations to Nolan and Marissa. Now, those ribbons were entirely absent. The flowers had been stripped of their false ownership, standing as neutral, silent decorations. The visual cue struck Victor with the force of a physical blow. He reached out and grabbed Nolan's arm, pointing silently at the vacant arrangements with a trembling finger. "This is an administrative mistake," Marissa stammered, her voice bouncing frantically off the high ceilings. She looked at her parents, her eyes wide with a terrifying, entirely manufactured conviction. "Avery cannot do this. She cannot touch the property. The legal paperwork was finalized. The penthouse has been mine for months. It is legally, permanently mine." She was attempting to bend reality with sheer volume, desperately trying to maintain the structural integrity of the illusion even as the roof collapsed directly onto her head. I stepped out of the shadows. I was not wearing imported silk or delicate lace. I wore a tailored, dark charcoal wool suit and flat leather shoes. I moved across the marble floor with the silent, deliberate precision of a predator who had successfully boxed its prey into a corner. Rowan Bell walked closely on my right side, holding a sleek, heavy leather briefcase. The senior legal counsel representing the building's homeowner association walked on my left. I did not raise my voice to announce my presence. I did not storm across the floor in a fit of rage. I simply walked forward and stood directly between my family and the locked elevator doors, creating an impenetrable human barrier. Nolan saw me, and his eyes darted wildly for an escape route. Finding none, he immediately defaulted to the only survival strategy he had ever successfully deployed: emotional manipulation heavily disguised as familial duty. He lunged forward, stopping just a few feet away, holding his hands out in a placating, pathetic gesture. "Avery," he breathed, his voice dripping with a forced, sickeningly sweet intimacy. "What are you doing? Please, look at us. Tonight is my wedding night. I just married the woman of my dreams in front of hundreds of people. You cannot make a scene right now. If you do this, if you blow this situation up tonight, you are going to destroy absolutely everything I have ever worked for. We are family. Please. Let us upstairs, and we can sit down tomorrow morning. Just the 5 of us, and fix whatever minor misunderstanding you have." I did not engage with his emotional theater. I did not flinch, and I did not offer a comforting smile. I slowly extended my right hand. Rowan opened his briefcase and placed a single, crisp sheet of paper into my palm. It was not a drafted argument or a list of grievances. It was a legally binding execution order. I held it up so the harsh lobby lights illuminated the embossed notary seal. "There is absolutely no misunderstanding to fix," I stated, my voice as cold and flat as a sheet of winter ice. "This is a certified, executed copy of the transfer revocation clause. You clearly failed to read the specific fine print of the protective residency agreement I drafted 6 months ago. The transfer of ownership was never completed. The deed was entirely contingent upon a 24-month probationary period, completely free of fraudulent activity, secondary corporate liens, or unapproved third-party collateral usage." I paused for a single second, allowing the crushing weight of the legal reality to suffocate the space between us. "You violated every single condition. The property reverted to my absolute, unencumbered control several hours ago." The absolute, chilling certainty in my voice shattered their unified front instantly. The cartel broke. Basic survival instinct engaged, and the cornered rats immediately began turning their teeth on each other. Marissa's false bravado vanished entirely. Her face crumpled, and actual, panic-induced tears began to streak through her expensive cosmetic foundation. She spun around rapidly, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Nolan's chest. "I did not want to do this," she shrieked, her voice echoing wildly through the empty lobby. "He forced my hand. Nolan came to me begging for collateral. He told me the Whitmore family would cancel the entire engagement if he could not immediately prove he possessed equal liquid assets. I only generated that document to save him from total social and financial humiliation. It was his specific idea to leverage the equity for his failing business." Nolan's expression instantly twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. The golden boy facade dissolved completely, revealing the desperate, hollow core beneath. He violently shoved Marissa's pointing hand away. "You lying parasite," he spat, completely ignoring Victor and Elaine, who were watching the collapse in horrified, paralyzed silence. "You came to me with the entire plan. You explicitly promised me the penthouse was a vital condition, a guaranteed asset to help me secure this marriage. You told me you had already successfully bypassed Avery's security protocols on her old computer. You wanted the social elevation just as desperately as I did. You used my wedding to buy your way back into Beacon Hill." They were screaming at each other, their voices bouncing viciously off the marble pillars, completely consumed by their frantic, mutual betrayal. They were so loud, so violently engaged in tearing each other's alibis apart, that they did not hear the soft, melodic chime of the public elevator arriving in the lobby behind them. They did not hear the heavy steel doors slide open. I saw her before they did. Celeste stepped out of the carriage. She was still wearing her magnificent, heavy silk wedding gown, the intricate train dragging softly across the polished floor. However, the radiant bridal glow had been entirely replaced by an expression of cold, absolute horror. She stood completely frozen on the edge of the lobby. She had followed them. She had walked quietly into the building and listened. She had heard enough. She had stood in silence and listened to the groom and his sister openly admit, screaming at the top of their lungs, that the entire foundation of her marriage was a fabricated lie built on stolen property and forged signatures. Nolan and Marissa finally noticed my gaze shift over their shoulders. They followed my eyes and turned around slowly. The silence that slammed into the lobby was absolute and deafening. Victor closed his eyes tightly, as if bracing for a physical impact. Elaine raised a trembling hand to cover her mouth. Nolan looked at his new bride, his jaw completely slack, stripped of every single lie he had ever meticulously crafted. The tension was pulled so tight I could practically hear it humming in the cold air. The grand illusion was dead, murdered by their own panicked confessions. But I knew this was still not the end. A confession born of sudden panic can be walked back. A desperate man will inevitably try to spin a screaming match into a misunderstanding. If I wanted to excise this rot from my life permanently, I could not just let them argue in a lobby. I needed the concrete, irrefutable evidence displayed in the harsh light of day, leaving absolutely no dark corners for them to hide in. Rowan Bell did not wait for the heavy, suffocating silence in the lobby to dissipate. He stepped forward with the calculated grace of an executioner, placed his heavy leather briefcase onto the polished marble surface of the concierge desk, and unclasped the brass locks. The sharp metallic sound echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous space. He withdrew the final, comprehensive legal dossier and spread the documents out under the harsh, modern architectural lighting. I gestured for Celeste to step closer. She did not hesitate. She walked past her new husband without making a single second of eye contact and stopped directly beside me. I pointed to the top layer of paper. These were not mere accusations or emotional theories. They were certified notary records, digital signature login logs detailing exact times and internet protocol addresses, and a thick stack of printed internal emails exchanged between Marissa and Nolan. I also presented the undeniable, physical proof that my mother, Elaine, had deliberately intercepted and hidden every single piece of legal correspondence mailed to my childhood home over the past 6 months. The most damning piece of evidence, however, was a printed screenshot of a text message thread retrieved by the forensic team. I slid it directly in front of Celeste, ensuring she had a clear view. It was a message Marissa had sent to Nolan just 3 days prior. It read, in stark, unforgiving, black and white text, that all they had to do was keep me entirely out of the wedding and everything would be fine, because I always softened up once a situation was a completed reality. Their ultimate overarching strategy was finally laid bare for everyone to see. The plan was never just about securing the private loan. The grand finale was to bring Celeste up to the 32nd floor immediately after the reception, arrange a professional photo shoot of the happy couple in their supposed new luxury home, and publish the images across every social media platform and high society publication in Boston. They fully intended to use those glamorous photographs to essentially blackmail me into total silence. They gambled my entire career on the arrogant assumption that I would simply surrender my multi-million-dollar asset rather than subject my pristine professional reputation to a messy, highly publicized family scandal. Nolan tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, pathetic rasp emerged. He looked exactly like a man standing on the edge of a rapidly crumbling cliff. Finally realizing gravity was about to take hold, I turned my attention back to the entire group, sweeping my gaze over my parents and my siblings. I informed them, in a voice entirely devoid of anger or sorrow, that the floral arrangements they saw being removed from the lobby, the large moving trucks currently idling in the underground loading dock, and the technical crew upstairs conducting a structural inventory were not there to prepare the residents for a romantic honeymoon return. I had activated the ownership clawback clause many hours ago. Furthermore, I had just executed a rapid cash sale of the property to a prominent medical executive. The new owner would be taking full, legal possession of the unit by Wednesday of the following week. Celeste stood perfectly still. She read through the compiled evidence meticulously, her eyes tracking over the forged signature, the predatory loan documents, and the desperate, scheming text messages. The brutal realization washed over her striking features. She finally understood that her prestigious family name, her impeccable social reputation, and her very presence had been utilized as nothing more than a counterfeit access pass to elevate a family of desperate frauds into the upper echelon of society. She did not scream. She did not hurl the heavy binder across the lobby or collapse into a fit of hysterical tears. The women of Beacon Hill are taught from birth how to bleed out without ever ruining their formal wear. Celeste slowly reached down and took hold of the massive, brilliant-cut diamond ring on her left hand. She slid it smoothly off her finger. She turned to Nolan, who was practically hyperventilating against the reception desk. She did not throw the jewelry at his chest. She simply reached out, took his trembling right hand, and placed the ring flatly into his open palm. The words she spoke next dropped the temperature in the room to absolute zero. She looked directly into his eyes and stated, with terrifying calm, that she did not marry into a family that treats financial fraud as a standard premarital ritual. She turned on her heel, the heavy silk of her wedding gown whispering loudly across the marble floor, and walked back out of the glass doors into the cold night air. She stepped into her waiting black town car and disappeared into the city, effectively erasing the Ford family from her future in less than 5 minutes. Victor finally broke. He rushed forward, his face flushed with a desperate, pathetic panic. He grabbed the sleeve of my charcoal suit, genuine tears welling in his aging eyes. He begged me not to hand the forensic files over to the authorities. He pleaded with me to keep this an internal civil matter. Falling back on the oldest, most exhausted argument in his entire parental arsenal. He cried that despite everything that had happened, we were still blood, and blood had to protect each other from the outside world. I looked down at his shaking hand on my sleeve. For the first time in my entire 34 years of life, I looked at my father and felt absolutely zero obligation to his comfort or his survival. I stepped back, forcing his hand to drop away from my clothing. I told him, looking directly into his face, that a bloodline is merely a biological fact. It is not, and never will be, a permanent license for the unauthorized use of my hard-earned assets, my legal identity, and my future. The execution of justice over the following weeks was swift and absolute. I instructed Rowan to forward the entire fraudulent dossier to the appropriate civil and criminal divisions of the state. The predatory private loan remained permanently frozen. Stonemere Capital, realizing their collateral was entirely vapor, immediately redirected their notoriously aggressive legal collection efforts directly toward Nolan. Within 48 hours, his event company was placed into involuntary receivership. Marissa found her own modest checking accounts completely frozen by the subsequent legal blasts. The carefully constructed, faux aristocratic reputation the Ford family had desperately tried to build using my money collapsed entirely overnight. They were completely ruined in Boston, permanently exiled from the wealthy circles they had sacrificed their own daughter to join. As for the capital, the rapid sale of the Back Bay property yielded a substantial 8-figure return. I did not absorb the funds back into my personal investment portfolio. Instead, I used the recovered millions to establish a quiet, heavily fortified legal and short-term housing foundation. I designed the organization specifically to support adult women who find themselves financially isolated, abused, and manipulated by predatory family members. The foundation provides aggressive legal representation, forensic accounting services, and secure urban housing for those extricating themselves from domestic theft. I spent the first 3 decades of my life trying to purchase a seat at a table where the people closest to me only viewed me as a convenient line of credit. I am entirely done trying to buy my way into my old family. I took the heavy bricks they threw at me and used them to build an entirely new room. And in this new room, absolutely no one is allowed to walk through the door carrying a lie. Thank you all so much for listening to my story tonight. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please drop your location in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting the hype button, so this story can be heard by as many people as possible.